golden glow of the afternoon sun streamed through the tall, arched windows of the White House press room, casting a warm hue across the polished wooden podium that had become Karoline Leavitt's battlefield. At 27, she stood as the poised and unflinching press secretary for President Donald Trump, a role that demanded both grit and grace under the relentless scrutiny of a divided nation. She paused before the full-length mirror near her office door, her fingers brushing the delicate silver cross necklace that hung just below her collarbone. A cherished gift from her mother, a devout woman from a small Georgia town who'd raised her on hymns and hard work. The cross caught the light, glinting softly, a quiet reminder of the faith that grounded her amidst the chaos of Washington. On her desk nearby, a stack of briefing notes sat neatly aligned next to a dog-eared law textbook, its pages worn from years of study, while her phone buzzed with a fresh text from Trump himself. "Keep them quiet today." It was a typical directive from a man who thrived on boldness, and Karoline smirked faintly, knowing the press corps waiting beyond those doors would be anything but silent. She adjusted her blazer, the crisp fabric hugging her frame, and took a steadying breath, her reflection a blend of determination and calm resolve, ready to face whatever storm the day might bring. Karoline Leavitt hadn't stumbled into this high-stakes position by chance. Her journey to the White House was paved with a sharp legal mind honed at Georgetown University, where she'd graduated near the top of her law class, and an unshakable loyalty that had caught Trump's eye during his campaign. She'd traded a promising career in courtroom litigation for the unpredictable arena of political messaging, a choice driven by her belief that words could shape justice as powerfully as any gavel. In her 2 years as press secretary, she'd become a master at deflecting the barbed questions of hostile reporters, wielding her knowledge of constitutional law like a shield to defend the administration's every move. Her debates were legendary, quick-witted, precise, and often leaving her opponents grasping for a comeback. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Karoline carried a private anchor, that silver cross, a symbol of the faith she'd clung to since childhood, even when it drew raised eyebrows in the secular corridors of power. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of her identity, a connection to the Sundays spent in a wooden pew listening to her mother's soft prayers, a tether to a life before the spotlight. In a city that thrived on cynicism, it was her quiet rebellion, though she knew it painted a target on her back among those eager to see Trump's team falter. Still, she wore it daily, a small act of defiance against the pressure to conform, and so far it had never cost her more than a few snide remarks, until today. The sharp ring of her phone cut through the stillness, pulling her from her thoughts, and she snatched it up to hear Trump's familiar growl on the other end. "Karoline, we've got trouble brewing at the Montgomery County Courthouse in Maryland. Some federal employee got slapped with a fine for wearing a cross while testifying. Can you believe it? X is blowing up over this. Go check it out and get back to me with the details." His voice carried that mix of indignation and urgency she'd come to expect, and she could almost picture him pacing the Oval Office, tie loosened, ready to turn this into his next rallying cry. Karoline's pulse quickened, not because the task was unusual, but because it hit close to home, a faint echo of the battles her own family had faced over faith in a world quick to judge. "On it, sir," she replied, her tone steady as she grabbed her coat from the rack, the silver cross catching a final glint of sunlight as she moved. She slipped into her sleek Jeep parked outside, the engine humming to life as she merged into the snarl of DC traffic, the radio crackling with Trump's latest speech on religious freedom, a topic he'd championed fiercely since day one. The drive to Montgomery wasn't long, but it gave her just enough time to mull over what she might find. A simple courtroom spat or something bigger, something that could ripple back to the White House. She adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her own determined eyes, and pressed the gas a little harder, the cross resting cool against her skin as she sped toward the unknown. Whatever awaited her in that Maryland courthouse, she'd face it head-on, not just for Trump, but for the principles she'd sworn to uphold, both in law and in spirit. Tell me, folks, what do you think it's like when your job and your personal beliefs collide? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. Karoline Leavitt pushed through the glass doors of the Montgomery County Courthouse, the hum of late morning traffic fading behind her as she stepped into a sleek, modern lobby buzzing with restless energy. The building was a stark contrast to the marbled grandeur of Washington's federal courts. Here, polished steel and bright fluorescent lights framed a space packed with hurried lawyers, anxious defendants, and clerks shuffling stacks of paperwork. She adjusted her blazer, the silver cross necklace cool against her skin, and scanned the crowd for the courtroom number Trump had barked over the phone just an hour ago. At the front of courtroom 3, Judge Leonard Grayson presided from his elevated bench, a wiry figure at 60 with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for running his hearings like a drill sergeant commanding a boot camp. His sharp gray eyes flicked over the room, missing nothing, as the bailiff, Anna Kim, a petite woman with a no-nonsense voice, called for order, her words cutting through the low murmur of the gallery. Karoline slipped into a seat near the back, her phone already out, fingers poised to jot notes for the report Trump expected by sundown. She'd come straight from the White House, the echo of his urgency still ringing in her ears. And though she'd faced hostile press rooms and political firestorms, something about this small-town courthouse felt different, charged, like the air before a lightning strike. She settled in, her gaze shifting between the judge and the defendant's table, ready to observe whatever had set X ablaze and landed on Trump's radar. The case unfolded quickly, pulling her attention to James Carter, a federal employee in his mid-40s with a tired slump to his shoulders and a voice that wavered as he addressed the bench. He stood at the defendant's table, explaining a minor labor dispute with his supervisor, a disagreement over overtime pay that should have been routine. The kind of thing Karoline could have argued blindfolded back in her law school days. But then James stumbled into dangerous territory. "I told my boss I'd been praying about it, and I wore my cross that day because it keeps me steady." Grayson's head snapped up, his expression hardening as if the man had just confessed to a felony, and he cut in with a voice like gravel. "This courtroom isn't a place to flaunt your beliefs, Mr. Carter. It's a place for facts." He leaned forward, scribbling something on his notepad, then declared, "You're fined $350 for disrupting decorum with that cross. Next time, leave it at home." James opened his mouth to protest, but Grayson's gavel slammed down, silencing him as the clerk recorded the penalty with a practiced flick of her wrist. Karoline's brow furrowed, her fingers pausing over her phone as she typed a quick note. Fined for cross? Arbitrary? Her mind racing to connect this to Trump's call. She'd seen judges enforce quirky rules before, but this felt personal, pointed, and the unease creeping up her spine told her she'd stumbled into more than a simple overreach. She shifted in her seat, the silver cross resting against her chest suddenly heavier, as if it knew it was next in Grayson's sights. It didn't take long for that suspicion to become reality. Barely a minute passed before Grayson's gaze swept the room and landed on her, his eyes narrowing at the glint of silver peeking from beneath her blazer collar. "You there? Press secretary," he barked, his voice slicing through the courtroom's hum. "That cross you're wearing, take it off or pay $600 for contempt of court." The words hit like a slap, and a ripple of hushed gasps spread through the sparse crowd, heads turning to stare at her as if she'd just ignited a fuse. Karoline rose to her feet, her posture steady despite the sudden spotlight, and met his stare with the calm she'd perfected in front of baying reporters. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, here on official White House business," she said, her tone even but firm. "And this cross is my personal expression, protected under the First Amendment. It's no more disruptive than a tie clip or a watch." Grayson's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if savoring the challenge. "Not in my courtroom, Ms. Leavitt," he shot back. "This is a neutral space, and I decide what crosses the line. Pay the fine or get out." She glanced around, noting a man in the front row sporting a garish partisan pin on his lapel and a woman with a chunky beaded necklace dangling over her blouse, neither earning so much as a blink from Grayson. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her composure, slipping her phone into her pocket as she replied, "With all due respect, Judge, I'll pay it under protest. I'm not here to disrupt, but I won't be silenced either." The gavel cracked again, sealing the order, and Anna Kim stepped forward to collect the fine as Karoline pulled cash from her wallet, her mind already spinning with the implications. This wasn't just about her or James Carter. It was a thread she intended to unravel, and Grayson had no idea who he'd just provoked. So, tell me, what would you do if someone fined you for something personal like that? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'm curious to hear your take. Karoline Leavitt stood just outside the Montgomery County Courthouse, the crisp Maryland air brushing against her face as she fished her wallet from her purse, counting out 6 crisp $100 bills to hand over to Anna Kim, the bailiff who'd lingered by the exit with an apologetic shrug. The weight of the $600 fine didn't sting nearly as much as the principal it trampled, and as Anna scribbled a receipt, Karoline pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen to fire off a terse message to Trump. Grayson's targeting crosses. Something's off. I'm digging deeper. She hit send, the courthouse door swinging shut behind her with a dull thud, and turned to James Carter, who'd followed her out. His shoulders still slumped from the courtroom ordeal. This isn't the first time, he muttered, kicking at a pebble on the sidewalk. Grayson fined a co-worker of mine last year $200 for praying under his breath during a break. Guy's a quiet type, never caused trouble. Karoline's eyes narrowed, her mind snapping back to Grayson's smug dismissal, the way he'd zeroed in on her cross like it was a personal affront rather than a random rule enforcement. She'd seen bias before. Years of sparring with reporters had sharpened her nose for it. But this felt different. Less like a quirk and more like a deliberate jab, a thread begging to be pulled. She nodded at James, promising to follow up, and as he shuffled off toward his car, she stood there a moment longer, the silver cross resting against her chest as she mulled over the judge's cold stare. This wasn't just about courtroom decorum, and she'd be damned if she let it slide without finding out why. Her next move came over a steaming cup of coffee at a cramped diner a few blocks from the courthouse, the kind of place with sticky tables and waitresses who called you hone without a second thought. Karoline slid into a booth across from Anna Kim, who'd agreed to meet after her shift, with a wary glance over her shoulder. The bailiff sipped her black coffee, then leaned in, her voice low as if the walls might be listening. Grayson's got a thing against anything tied to Trump. I've heard him griping to his buddies over beers at the bar down the street, saying, "Those MAGA types need to be put in their place." Karoline's pulse quickened, the pieces clicking together like a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving, and she jotted a note on her phone. Grayson, anti-Trump? Before pressing Anna for more, the bailiff hesitated, then added, "It's not just talk. He's been harder on anyone who looks like they'd vote for your boss." That was enough to light a fire under her, and by the time she left the diner, Karoline knew she couldn't unravel this alone. She needed backup, people who could dig where she couldn't. Back at the White House that evening, she cornered Ben Torres, a wiry 28-year-old tech whiz who'd been her go-to for data crunching since she'd started. He squinted at her over his laptop as she briefed him, then dove into Maryland court records, unearthing 25 similar finds over the past 2 years, all targeting religious symbols, all handed down by Grayson. Before she could process that, her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Hayes, a freelance journalist she'd met during the campaign, a woman with a knack for sniffing out dirt. "Heard you tangled with Grayson. Want to compare notes? I've been tracking him for months." Karoline grinned, replying with a quick, "Meet me tomorrow," already sensing the team she needed was falling into place, each ally a step closer to whatever Grayson was hiding. The real breakthrough came the next afternoon, when Karoline sat sandwiched between Ben and Rachel in a cluttered corner of a Rockville coffee shop, the air thick with the scent of espresso and the hum of laptops as they pored over a stack of printouts and Ben's glowing screen. He tapped a spreadsheet he'd built overnight, his voice tight with excitement. "Check this. These finds spike right before meetings of a local group called Marylanders for Progress. I cross-referenced dates, and it's no coincidence." Karoline leaned closer, her eyes scanning the data. $200 here, $300 there, all hitting people with crosses, prayer beads, even a yarmulke. "The penalties clustering like clockwork around those gatherings," Rachel chimed in, sliding a worn notebook across the table, her handwriting a scrawl of dates and names. "That group's a front. Bunch of anti-Trump activists with deep pockets. I've got sources saying Grayson's tight with their steering committee. a guy named Paul Dennison who's been gunning to discredit Trump since the last election. She flipped a page, pointing to a scribbled note. Grayson bragged at a fundraiser about keeping Trump's people in line. And Karoline felt a chill settle in her bones, the realization sinking in that this wasn't just one judge's petty grudge. Ben nodded, adding, "I dug into Dennison's emails, public record stuff, and there's a thread about using the courts to send a message." Grayson's name pops up 3 times. Karoline sat back, her coffee cooling untouched as she pieced it together. Grayson wasn't acting alone. He was a cog in a machine, targeting folks like James Carter, and now her, to chip away at Trump's base, one fine at a time. She tapped her fingers against the table, the silver cross catching the light as she murmured, "He's playing politics with a gavel. So what's their endgame?" Rachel met her gaze, her voice grim. "To make Trump look weak. Prove his talk about freedom's just hot air. Starting with people like you." Karoline's jaw tightened, the stakes sharpening into focus. This was bigger than a courtroom spat, and she'd just stepped into the middle of it, armed with nothing but her wits and a growing crew of allies determined to blow it wide open. "Hey, have you ever caught someone misusing their power for personal reasons? Drop your stories in the comments. I'd love to hear what you've seen out there." The Rockville coffee shop had grown quieter as the afternoon waned, the clatter of mugs and hum of conversation fading into a dull background roar. But Karoline Leavitt barely noticed, her focus locked on the glowing screen of Ben Torres's laptop as he hunched over it, his fingers dancing across the keys with a feverish intensity that matched the storm brewing in her chest. She'd barely slept after their meeting the day before, the weight of Grayson's fines and Rachel's revelations pressing against her like a vice. And now Ben's voice cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. "I got something, old emails from Grayson's county account. It's a risk, but I had to poke around." Karoline leaned in, her breath catching as he pulled up a thread dated 6 months back. The subject line a bland, "Court updates," that belied the bombshell within. Grayson's words to a local official named Carl Whitaker. "We keep hitting Trump's people where it hurts. Find them, scare them. Make them think twice about flashing their loyalty." Her eyes traced the text, each sentence tightening the knot in her gut, and she glanced at Rachel Hayes, who sat across the table nursing a black coffee, her weathered notebook open to a page of scribbled leads. "That's not all," Rachel said, her tone grim as she tapped a line in her notes. "Whitaker's a big shot in Marylanders for progress. I've got a source who heard him ranting about turning Trump's religious freedom talk into a punchline. They're building a narrative, and Grayson's their hammer." Karoline sat back, the pieces snapping into place. Those 25 fines Ben had flagged weren't random. They were calculated strikes, a slow bleed meant to erode the administration's credibility, one petty penalty at a time. And she'd just walked right into their crosshairs. The discovery gnawed at her as she drove back to D.C. that evening, the Jeep's headlights cutting through the gathering dusk while her mind churned, replaying the coffee shop briefing and the unease that had settled over their trio like a fog. She needed confirmation, something solid to take this beyond suspicion, and Anna Kim was her next stop. She found the bailiff at a quiet park bench near the White House, the late spring air thick with the scent of blooming dogwoods as Anna sat twisting a paper napkin in her hands, her eyes darting nervously before she spoke. "Grayson's bragged about it. I heard him last month, laughing with a couple of lawyer pals at a bar, saying he could make the White House look like fools if he played his cards right." Karoline's stomach lurched, her fingers tightening around her phone as she pressed for more, and Anna's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's been at it since Trump got back in, thinks he's untouchable." Before Karoline could respond, Ben texted her a file. A leaked memo from Marylanders for Progress, dated just after the inauguration, outlining a plan to target visible Trump supporters in public roles and use judicial pressure to expose hypocrisy. Grayson's signature sat at the bottom, a scrawled endorsement of their scheme. She stared at the screen, the words blurring as the full scope hit her. This wasn't just one judge's vendetta. It was a coordinated attack, a political hit job masquerading as courtroom discipline. And Grayson had been waiting for someone like her to step into his trap. She thanked Anna with a curt nod, her voice steady despite the shock rippling through her. This wasn't about crosses or decorum anymore. It was about power, and she'd just become the latest pawn in their game. The weight of it all crashed down harder when she got back to her office. The White House halls eerily silent as night settled over the Capitol, and her phone rang with Trump's name flashing on the screen. She answered, bracing herself for the gruff urgency she knew was coming. "Karoline, what's this mess in Maryland?" he growled, his voice crackling through the speaker. "I'm hearing whispers. Be careful. If they tie you to me on this, it's going to get ugly fast." She could hear the rustle of papers on his end, the faint murmur of aides in the background, and she pictured him pacing, his tie askew as he weighed the political fallout. "I've got it under control, sir," she replied, forcing calm into her tone, "but it's bigger than we thought." "I'll brief you tomorrow." He grunted his approval and hung up, leaving her alone with the hum of her desk lamp and the buzz of her phone, as X lit up with cross-conspiracy trending, hundreds of posts dissecting her courtroom clash, some hailing her as a defender of faith, others sneering Trump's puppet and White House stooge. The venom stung more than she'd expected, each barb a reminder of how exposed she'd become. And she sank into her chair, her fingers brushing the silver cross as the day's revelations replayed in her mind. Grayson, Whitaker, the memo, all aimed at dismantling Trump's image through people like her and James Carter. She closed her eyes, the chaos fading for a moment as her mother's voice echoed from years past. "Patience is your strongest weapon. Let them swing first, then strike smart." Karoline exhaled, the cross cool against her palm, and resolved to turn this trap into a weapon of her own. She'd need every ounce of that patience now, because Grayson and his cronies had just underestimated the wrong woman, and she was ready to prove it. So, what do you think about power being twisted for political games? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm eager to hear your take on this. Karoline Leavitt barely slept that night, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across her White House office as she hunched over a legal pad, her pen scratching out a battle plan that would turn Grayson's trap into her triumph. The memo, the emails, the fines, they'd all be her weapons, but she'd wield them with the patience her mother had drilled into her. A steady hand to counter the chaos swirling around her. She filed an appeal for her $600 fine with the Montgomery County Courthouse before dawn. Her argument, a razor-sharp blend of constitutional firepower, citing Church of Lukumi Babalu Ayi v. City of Hialeah, the 1993 Supreme Court ruling that struck down bans on religious expression as unconstitutional, and Tinker v. Des Moines, the 1969 case affirming that personal symbols didn't lose their protection in public spaces. She typed furiously, her fingers fueled by coffee and conviction, framing Grayson's actions as a blatant overreach that mocked the First Amendment's promise. By morning, she'd rallied her team. Ben Torres sat bleary-eyed at his laptop, compiling a list of Grayson's 25 victims, complete with dates, fines, and personal stories, a dossier that painted a damning picture of targeted harassment. Rachel Hayes, meanwhile, took to X with a vengeance, posting screenshots of Grayson's incriminating emails under the hashtag #CrossConspiracy. Her thread racking up thousands of retweets as the internet erupted with outrage and support. Karoline paced her office, the silver cross glinting under the fluorescent lights as she mapped out her dual strategy, not just to win in court, but to shield Trump's image from the political vultures circling overhead. She'd need every ounce of her legal genius and every shred of that patience to pull this off, because Grayson wasn't just a judge anymore, he was a symbol of something bigger, and she'd make sure the world saw it. She grabbed her coat, the appeal papers tucked under her arm, and headed back to Maryland, her Jeep cutting through the early traffic as she steeled herself for the fight ahead, knowing this wasn't just about her fine. It was about every name on Ben's list, and the administration she'd sworn to defend. The Montgomery County Courthouse buzzed with an electric tension when Karoline strode through its glass doors 2 days later, the lobby packed with more spectators than she'd seen before. Word had spread, thanks to Rachel's X-storm, and the gallery overflowed with curious locals, a few reporters, and even a handful of Trump supporters waving pocket constitutions. She took her place at the appellant's table, her blazer crisp and her expression calm, while Leonard Grayson loomed above on his bench, his salt and pepper hair catching the light as he glared down at her with a smirk that oozed contempt. "So, Miss Leavitt, you think you can waltz in here and lecture me?" he sneered as she began, his voice dripping with mockery, but Karoline didn't flinch, stepping forward with her appeal in hand. "Judge Grayson, you've turned this courtroom into a political weapon. Here's the proof." She laid out the emails Ben had uncovered, her voice steady as she read aloud Grayson's own words. "Scare Trump's people." Then pivoted to the memo from Marylanders for Progress. Its call to target visible supporters, now a public indictment. She called Anna Kim to the stand, the bailiff's hands trembling as she confirmed under oath. "I saw those messages myself. Grayson sent them from his office." Grayson's face darkened, his gavel slamming down as he roared, "This is slander! You're out of line!" But Karoline held her ground, her gaze unflinching. "No, sir. The law will judge this, not you. Lukumi and Tinker say my cross, and James Carter's, are protected rights, not disruptions. And your fines are a pattern of abuse tied to a political agenda." She spread Ben's list across the table. 25 names, 25 stories, her voice rising with quiet power. "This isn't about decorum. It's about punishing people for who they support, and that ends today." The room hung in silence, Grayson's smirk fading as the weight of her evidence pressed down. He fumbled for a retort, but the crowd's murmurs grew into cheers when he muttered, "Appeal granted," his gavel striking with a hollow thud that echoed like defeat. Karoline exhaled, the silver cross steady against her chest as she gathered her papers, knowing the real victory was still hours away. She'd won the battle, but the war for Trump's image was about to hit the airwaves. She didn't waste a minute after leaving the courthouse, racing back to D.C. with the taste of triumph still fresh as she prepared for the White House press briefing that evening. The press room's bright lights and buzzing cameras, a familiar stage she'd now turn into her megaphone. She stood behind the podium, her blazer smoothed and her notes minimal, facing a sea of reporters hungry for the next soundbite. As she launched into her opening, "What happened in Montgomery wasn't just about me. It's about every American's right to live their faith without fear. Judge Grayson tried to silence that, but we proved him wrong, and we did it with patience, not rage." She laid out the story. James Carter's fine, her own clash, the emails, the memo, her voice measured but firm, weaving a narrative of resilience that sidestepped partisan mudslinging. "This administration stands for freedom," she continued, "but we don't win by shouting. We win by building trust, step by step, and that's what we'll keep doing." The room erupted with questions, but she fielded them with the same cool precision she'd used on Grayson, deflecting accusations of grandstanding with facts and turning every jab into a chance to reinforce Trump's message. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with a tweet from Trump himself. "Karoline Leavitt just showed the world what real strength looks like. Great job." And the press corps scrambled to capture it, their feeds lighting up as cross-conspiracy surged again, this time with posts hailing Trump's legal genius and the voice of reason in chaos. Grayson's name trended too, but not in his favor. Ex-users dissected his loss, his smug facade crumbling under viral clips of Karoline's courtroom takedown that Rachel had slipped to a local blogger. One post read, "Grayson thought he'd bury her. Now he's the one buried," and Karoline allowed herself a small smile as she stepped off the podium, the silver cross catching the camera flashes. She'd turned the tables. Not with a sledgehammer, but with the steady, patient precision her mother had taught her. Grayson's political hit had backfired, and the administration emerged stronger, her words echoing beyond the room to a nation watching, waiting, and now cheering. The briefing wrapped, and she slipped back to her office, the roar of the press fading as she braced for what came next. This wasn't the end, but it was a hell of a turning point, and she'd made sure every eye in America saw it. So, which moment in Karoline's comeback hit you the hardest? Vote in the comments. I can't wait to see what you loved most. The Montgomery County Courthouse felt like a different world when Karoline Leavitt left it behind that afternoon, the roar of the gallery's cheers still ringing in her ears as she stepped into the late spring sunlight, her Jeep waiting in the lot like a faithful steed after a hard-fought battle. Within hours, the news broke. Leonard Grayson was suspended pending a full investigation, his gavel silenced by the weight of Karoline's appeal and the avalanche of evidence she'd unleashed. By the next morning, the court clerk's office had quietly voided her $600 fine and James Carter's $350 penalty. The paperwork stamped with a bureaucratic finality that felt almost anticlimactic after the storm she'd weathered. Her phone buzzed as she sipped coffee in her White House office, Trump's voice bursting through the line with a hearty laugh. "Karoline, you're gold. Pure gold. You stuck it to that clown Grayson and made us look good doing it." She could hear the grin in his tone, the rustle of his suit as he paced, and she smiled faintly, murmuring a quick "thank you, sir," before he hung up, no doubt already plotting how to spin this into his next rally cry. X lit up faster than she could refresh the app, cross-conspiracy trending higher than ever as users flooded the platform. Some called her Trump's defender of freedom, others simply the woman who took down a tyrant judge, their posts piling up with screenshots of her courtroom showdown and clips from the press briefing, the digital tide turning Grayson's name into a punchline overnight. She leaned back in her chair, the silver cross resting against her chest, and let the moment settle. Not as a personal victory, but as the first crack in a wall she'd vowed to dismantle, knowing the real fallout was just beginning. Back in the quieter corners of her world, Karoline watched her team bloom in the aftermath, their roles shifting as the dust cleared. Anna Kim, the bailiff who'd trembled on the stand, found her footing in the weeks that followed, taking a leave from the courthouse to join a Maryland task force on judicial reform. She'd texted Karoline one evening, her words simple but firm. "I'm done staying quiet. Your fight showed me that." Ben Torres, the tech whiz who'd cracked Grayson's emails, got a call from Trump's chief of staff the next day, a promotion to a senior data role in the White House communications team, landing him a bigger desk and a grin he couldn't wipe off. He'd stopped by Karoline's office with a coffee and a sheepish, "couldn't have done it without you," but she waved him off, her focus already elsewhere. Rachel Hayes turned her notebook into gold too, publishing a scathing exposé in a national outlet titled "The Judge Who Targeted Trump's Faithful," her byline cementing her as the go-to voice on judicial overreach. Karoline got an early copy, the pages dog-eared by the time she finished reading, a quiet nod of respect for the woman who'd lit the match. That night she gathered them in her cramped office, the air thick with the scent of takeout pizza as she raised a soda can in a mock toast. "We didn't win because I'm some genius. We won because we stayed patient, played it smart. This is your victory as much as mine." They laughed, clinking cans, but her words hung there, a truth she'd carried since her mother's lessons in Georgia. Later, alone, she pinned the voided find receipt to her wall beside the silver cross, the paper curling slightly at the edges. A reminder not of triumph, but of the steady resolve that had carried her through. A talisman against the noise still echoing outside her door. The ripples spread wider than Karoline had dared to hope, the Montgomery clash igniting a slow burn that reached beyond her office walls and into the fabric of Maryland's legal system. Within a month, the state's Judicial Oversight Board announced a review of courtroom regulations, spurred by the flood of complaints Ben's victim list had unleashed. Petitions from fined citizens, letters from lawyers, even a quiet push from a few local lawmakers who'd caught wind of Grayson's scheme through Rachel's article. Karoline's press briefing words, "This administration stands for freedom, but we win by building trust," hadn't just faded into the ether. A junior staffer clipped the footage, and it went viral, racking up millions of views as ex-users shared it with captions like, "Finally, someone who gets it," and "Trump's got a keeper in Leavitt." The phrase, "intelligence and patience build trust," stuck, quoted in editorials and Sunday sermons alike, a mantra that turned her moment of defiance into a call for something deeper. People didn't just see a win, they saw a path forward, a way to fight without tearing everything down. Her inbox pinged one quiet afternoon with a message from a federal worker in Baltimore, a woman named Lisa, who wrote, I've worn my cross every day since I saw you on TV. Your courage made me feel safe to keep my faith. Thank you. Karoline read it twice, her throat tightening as she set the phone down, the silver cross cool against her skin. This wasn't about headlines or hashtags. It was about Lisa, James, and every name on that list. People who'd felt the same sting she had and now stood a little taller because of it. She leaned against her desk, the hum of the White House a distant pulse, and realized the fight had shifted, not just a defense of Trump, but a quiet revolution built on the patience she'd preached, a legacy that might outlast the chaos of any single administration. So, how could Karoline's story inspire you to make a difference? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your ideas. Karoline Leavitt stood alone on the south lawn of the White House, the cool night air brushing against her face as she gazed up at the moon hanging low over the Capitol, its pale light catching the silver cross necklace that rested against her chest. A quiet companion through the storm she'd just weathered, the hum of DC traffic faded into a distant murmur, leaving her with the stillness she'd craved after weeks of chaos. Her mind drifting over the courtroom clash, the press room victory, and the lives she'd touched along the way. She'd turned Grayson's attack into a shield for Trump, but as she stood there, the weight of Lisa's email and Anna's resolve settled deeper. This wasn't just about beating a judge or defending an administration. It was about building trust, brick by patient brick, in a world quick to tear it down. Her phone buzzed, Trump's name lighting up the screen with a blunt text. "National conference wants you to speak. Ready to take this show on the road." She chuckled softly, the corners of her mouth lifting into a tired but genuine smile, and typed back a simple "yes, sir," her head tilting in a nod to the sky as if sealing a promise. The fight had forged her into something more than a press secretary, and she was ready to carry it forward. "Intelligence opens the door, but patience keeps it wide," she murmured to herself, the words crystallizing the lesson she'd learned through every fine, every email, every sleepless night. A truth born from conflict and shaped into unity. She pulled a notepad from her pocket, scribbling "Build, don't break" in the dim glow, a final note to guide her next steps, then slipped it back, the cross glinting as she turned toward the future.